Let me start with something that should be obvious, but has been buried so effectively that almost no one says it out loud. Friday the 13th is not old. The specific, crystallized terror of a Friday colliding with the 13th day of a month does not trace back cleanly to the ancient world the way we have always been led to believe. Further I pushed into the historical record, the more the timeline refused to hold still. What I uncovered was not a superstition that grew slowly and naturally from centuries of accumulated human fear. What I uncovered was something that looks, the more you examine it, far more like a deliberate assembly. Something built from components that were once individually powerful, individually sacred, and then methodically recombined into something people were meant to dread. Not coincidence, not folklore drifting on the wind, not the slow sediment of bad luck piling up across generations. Something else entirely, and that difference, that distinction between something that emerged and something that was constructed, matters in ways that will not leave you after this is over. Here is the version we have been handed. We are told that 13 has always been sinister, an intruder in the elegant sequence of 12, an uninvited presence at the apostles' table, a rupture in the cosmic order that humanity instinctively recoils from. We are told that Friday carries its own ancient darkness, the day of crucifixion, the day Eve reached for the fruit, the day misfortune enters through whatever door you forgot to lock. And we are told that when these two ancient anxieties finally collided, they fused into something uniquely terrible. A day so cursed it required its own clinical name, paraskevoid, catriophobia, fear of Friday the 13th. A word so precise and so sterile, it almost conceals how genuinely strange the thing it describes actually is. But here is the question that no one seems to be asking. What did 13 mean before it meant danger? What did Friday mean before it meant shadow? Because something existed before the fear. Something was there first, and it was replaced. And once you look directly at what that something was, once you actually see it, the official story does not just weaken. It collapses, quietly, completely. Let us talk about Friday. Not the Friday we received, but the one that existed before the church calendar, before the Gregorian reckoning, before the slow institutional standardization of Western time rewrote the meaning of the days. The word itself is a key that has been sitting in plain sight. Freitag, Old English, Frigg's Day. Or perhaps Freya's Day. The etymological boundary between these two Norse goddesses has never been drawn with any real clarity, and that ambiguity is itself worth noting. Both of them represent love, fertility, abundance, the deep generative ordering power of the feminine. In Latin traditions, the same day carries a different name but an identical meaning. Dies Veneris, Venus's day. The planet Venus, the goddess Venus, the principle of Venus, beauty, desire, creation, the morning star, the evening star, the single celestial body luminous enough to throw shadows on a clear night. Friday was not always feared. Across multiple pre-Christian traditions, stretching from northern Europe through the ancient Mediterranean and into the Near East, Friday was sacred. It was the day associated with the most generative force in the known cosmos, the day for celebration, for marriages, for gratitude, for the rituals of abundance. The pattern repeats with a precision that should unsettle you across cultures that had no documented contact with one another. Venus, Friday, feminine sacred energy, abundance, and then quietly, and then gradually, and then quite suddenly, the meaning flipped. This produces a simple but unavoidable question. When a symbol reverses its meaning across multiple cultures within a compressed historical window, do we call that coincidence? Or do we call it coordination? Now let us talk about 13, and I mean actually talk about it, not the shorthand. Not the Judas narrative, not the baker's dozen, not the number that does not fit. Let us go back further than any of that. 13 is the number of lunar cycles in a solar year, not approximately, not poetically, precisely. The moon completes 13 full cycles, 13 months of roughly 28 days each, within a single solar revolution of Earth. This is not mythology, this is not spirituality dressed up as fact, this is mathematics, this is astronomy. This is the kind of knowledge that ancient humans who watch the sky with an attention we have largely abandoned would have recognized immediately and built entire systems of meaning around. And they did. The deeper I moved into pre-Gregorian calendrical history, the more 13-month systems I found. The evidence is not hidden. It is scattered across archaeological records, anthropological studies, ethnographic accounts from indigenous peoples on nearly every inhabited landmass. The ancient Celtic tree calendar, 13 months, the Mayan Tzolk'in with its 13-day cycle forming the spine of an entire cosmological architecture. The ancient Egyptian civil calendar, structured around 13 units. The evidence from Mesoamerica, from West Africa, from pre-Roman Europe, from the indigenous cultures of North America, the pattern repeats without exception. 13 months, lunar reckoning, women's cycles synchronized with the moon's cycles, both running on approximately 28 days, both counting to 13 in a year. This is not coincidence, this is not metaphor. This is the actual mathematics of the Earth-Moon relationship, preserved with remarkable consistency in calendrical systems distributed across the ancient world. And then those systems were phased out, every single one of them, within a historically peculiar window, with a speed and thoroughness that does not match the pace of ordinary cultural evolution. The 12-month calendar, the Gregorian system, the Julian before it, the Roman system both descended from, imposed itself across the known world with what can only be described as institutional force. 12 months, 12 apostles, 12 gods of Olympus, 12 hours of the day and 12 of the night, 12 tribes, 12 signs of the zodiac as the primary organizational principle, rather than 13 lunar stations. 12 became sacred, 12 became correct, and 13, the number that had encoded the moon's own rhythm, the number embedded in calendrical systems across civilizations, became the remainder. The excess, the number that did not belong, not just unlucky, actively removed, erased, replaced, here is where the official narrative begins to crack along its seams. We are asked to accept that the transition from 13-month lunar calendars to 12-month solar ones was simply a matter of administrative convenience. A practical upgrade. The Julian calendar imposed Roman order on a chaotic patchwork of regional timekeeping, and through the inevitable logic of efficiency and reason, it won. That is the story, but look at what the evidence actually shows. The transition was not gradual in many regions. The documentation of the older systems is, in several cases, not merely incomplete. It is absent. What we have are remnants. Fragments surviving in manuscript margins, anomalous feast days that refuse to align with official liturgical logic, folk traditions that preserved 13-unit structures for centuries after the institutional calendar had abandoned them, as if the populations themselves never fully released something they had been instructed to forget. The silence was deafening. When a calendrical system is genuinely abandoned through organic cultural evolution, we expect to find the transition documented. We expect debates, correspondence, competing arguments, the paper trail of societies openly working something through. What we find instead, in case after case, is a gap, a before and an after, and in between very little. Almost nothing, as if certain records were not lost but cleared. This raises a question that deserves to be asked directly. Why would cultures that meticulously documented astronomical observations, agricultural cycles, and religious festivals leave almost no record of abandoning the very systems that had organized their entire experience of time? And here is the strangest detail of all. The places where 13-month systems survived the longest, the Ethiopian calendar still has 13 months, and Ethiopia was never colonized in the conventional sense, which may or may not be relevant, but is certainly worth sitting with, are precisely the places where the broader cultural campaign to stigmatize the number 13 took hold least completely. The pattern repeats with a precision that does not feel random. Let me be precise about what I mean when I use the word construction. I am not claiming that a group of men gathered around a candlelit table and agreed on a specific Tuesday in the medieval period to designate Friday the 13th as cursed. History rarely works through a single dramatic decision, and that framing is too convenient, too cinematic, too easy to dismiss as conspiratorial thinking. What I am suggesting is something more interesting, and I think more disturbing than a conspiracy, that the stigmatization of 13 and the inversion of Friday's sacred meaning were parallel processes, that they reinforced one another, that they served interlocking institutional purposes, and that their eventual fusion into the singular, durable phobia of Friday the 13th was the culmination of a long, slow, patient project of cultural reframing. Not a meeting, a momentum. The official explanation for Friday's unluckiness leans heavily on Christian tradition. The day of crucifixion, the day of the fall, but even this explanation, when you press it, begins to give. Those associations were themselves chosen. Of 7 days available in a week, why was the execution placed on Venus's day specifically? Why not another? The association of misfortune with Friday predates the widespread popularization of those narratives in forms that reached ordinary people. And when you trace the pre-Christian traditions that called Friday sacred, the Norse, the Roman, the broader Mediterranean world, you find that the inversion of Friday from sacred to cursed aligns, with striking precision, to the institutional suppression of the very traditions that had venerated it. This is not cultural drift. This is not random historical chance. This is what the systematic erasure of a symbol looks like when you step back far enough to see the full shape of it. And what does it mean practically when a superstition becomes successfully standardized? This is where the story becomes, to my mind, genuinely consequential. Not simply as historical curiosity, but as a case study in how perception is manufactured, and once manufactured, maintained almost indefinitely without any further instruction. The fear of Friday the 13th is not universal. Anthropologists have documented this carefully, even if that documentation rarely surfaces in popular accounts. In Spanish and Greek traditions, it is Tuesday the 13th that carries the omen, Mars Tris, Tuesday being named for Mars, the god of war and chaos. In Italy, 17 is the number of misfortune, not 13. These variations are not footnotes, they are evidence. They demonstrate that the specific fusion of Friday and 13 into a unified phobia is not the natural flowering of universal human intuition. It is particular, it is located. It emerged from a specific cultural tradition within a specific historical window, and was then exported through colonialism, through the dominance of Western calendrical systems, through the global spread of particular institutional forms, as though it had always been timeless truth. Once you see it, you cannot unsee it. The number 13 began to disappear from physical space. This is documented. Hotels numbered their floors without a 13th. Airlines removed row 13. Street addresses jumped from 12 to 14. Residential buildings across the Western world and its cultural satellites quietly agreed to pretend that a number did not exist. Not through any mandate, not through any visible coordination, but through a shared anxiety so successfully installed in the collective firmware of a culture that it required no further instruction to perpetuate itself indefinitely. This is what successful symbolic reframing looks like at full maturity, when a number can be physically removed from the built environment, from the architecture of the daily world people inhabit and move through, without significant protest, without most people even consciously registering the gap. That is not coincidence. That is the mark of something embedded at a depth ordinary observation does not reach. Let me describe the mechanism as precisely as I can. Repetition is the engine of normalized perception. Not argument, not proof, repetition. A claim, a symbol, an association. A meaning does not become cultural truth through a single authoritative statement. It becomes truth through the accumulation of iterations. Each time Friday the 13th is referenced with a slight tonal shift, a narrator's portentous pause, a film title, a hesitation before signing a contract dated the 13th, the association is reinforced. Each reinforcement demands less active attention to sustain. Eventually, the association operates in the deep background of consciousness, as assumption rather than conclusion, as instinct rather than belief. The theological arguments against 13, against Friday, against lunar reckoning, these were the initial installation. The folk traditions were the maintenance cycle. The horror films, the news segments, the jokes, the insurance industry's documented spikes in cautious behavior on Friday the 13th. These are the current iteration. The form changes continuously. The function is identical. What function? Here is where I want to be careful and precise, and resist the pull towards certainty that this kind of investigation can create. I do not know who benefits most from a population that has been trained to read the moon's own arithmetic as malevolent. I do not know whose interests were most served by the inversion of Venus's sacred day into a day of dread. I am asking the question, not delivering the answer, but the question seems worth asking, because the alternative, the official version, demands that we accept a very great deal as coincidence. That the number perfectly aligned with lunar cycles and with feminine sacred time became unlucky through uncoordinated cultural drift. That the day named for the planet of love and abundance became ominous through accident. That 13-month calendars were abandoned simply because 12 is administratively tidier. And that the systematic stigmatization of 13 as a number had nothing to do with the simultaneous theological and administrative projects that were discrediting the entire world. Those calendars encoded, that is a great deal to accept as coincidence, a very great deal. There is a kind of knowledge that does not survive institutional suppression well. It is not the knowledge preserved in books. Books survive when they are copied, indexed, sheltered by institutions that want them to persist. The knowledge I am describing is different. It is calendrical knowledge, embodied knowledge. The knowledge of people who organize their time, their bodies, their understanding of the cosmos, around a 28-day cycle that corresponded precisely to both the moon above and, not incidentally, the menstrual cycle below. When you stigmatize the number that encodes that cycle, you do not merely make a number unlucky. You make the entire framework of understanding that the number represents seem primitive, superstitious, pre-rational. You create the conditions under which people will voluntarily abandon a system of knowledge, not because they have been given a demonstrably superior one, but because they have been given a socially safer one, a system with institutional approval, a system that will not draw sideways glances. A system that will not associate you with the old knowledge and whatever connotations have by now been attached to it. The silence became personal, self-imposed. That is how the most effective forms of erasure operate. Not through external prohibition alone, but through the internalization of that prohibition by the very people it was designed to target, until they enforce it on themselves without any external pressure required. Once you see that mechanism, you begin to see it in other places, in other erasures, in other inversions, in other gaps in the historical record where something that was once centered quietly became marginal, without the documentation we would expect if the transition had been genuinely voluntary. The pattern at its core is this. Systems of knowledge tied to natural cycles, the lunar calendar, the feminine sacred, the number 13 as the accurate count of the moon's own completions in a year, were methodically reframed as primitive, as unlucky, as suspect, often within overlapping historical windows, often with far less documentation of the transition than we would expect if the process had been truly organic. There were alternatives, there were frameworks, they are largely gone, not because they failed on their own terms, but because the terms were changed. As if some process, some convergence of institutional interests with sufficient patience and reach, had decided that the moon's own count should become a source of anxiety rather than orientation. That Venus's day should carry shadow rather than light. That the fusion of the two, Friday and 13, should serve as a cultural shorthand for danger and misfortune, embedded so deeply in the collective nervous system that it would reproduce itself long after anyone remembered its origins or questioned its logic, not through one decision, not through one meeting, but through the slow accumulation of institutional preference, theological argument, narrative repetition, and the quiet removal of a number from the floors of buildings, as if even the architecture of the world should not have to remember what it once knew. I began this with the expectation of finding a curiosity, a folklore story with an interesting history, the kind of thing you mention at a dinner table and everyone nods and the conversation moves on. I did not find that. What I found was a template, a case study in how symbols are stripped of their original meaning, inverted, and redeployed as instruments of a different orientation entirely. One that trades the moon's own arithmetic for something tidier, something more controllable, something that locates authority not in the sky and its cycles, but in the institutions that appointed themselves the sky's interpreters. I cannot tell you precisely who made that trade. I cannot reconstruct the specific chain of decisions through which the lunar 13 became the unlucky 13, through which Venus's day became the cursed day, through which the combination of the two became something that causes people to flinch in the 21st century, in hotels with no 13th floor, on airplanes with no 13th row, in a culture that has largely ceased to remember what it once knew about the moon. But I can leave you with the questions. Why does a number that precisely encodes the moon's own rhythm become the number of misfortune in exactly the tradition that also worked most systematically to phase out lunar calendrical systems? Why does the day named for Venus, for love, for abundance, for the sacred feminine, become the day of dread in exactly the tradition that also worked most systematically to suppress the cultural and religious frameworks that had venerated those things? Why does the specific fusion of these two, Friday and 13, harden into a phobia so durable it survives into an era of space telescopes and genomic sequencing, still powerful enough to make educated people hesitate, still intact enough to quietly shape the architecture of buildings, still present enough that most people cannot tell you when it began or why? What exactly are we being instructed not to remember? And here is the question I cannot stop returning to. The one that keeps pulling me back to these calendrical fragments, these anomalous gaps, these margins of manuscripts where something old was almost entirely erased. If 13 was always sinister, always an intruder, always the wrong number, why did so many cultures, independently, across so much of the ancient world, use it to count the moon? The moon did not change, the mathematics did not change. The count of lunar cycles in a solar year has not shifted within any span of time available to human memory or record. 13 was always the right number, it still is, exactly as right as it ever was. The moon does not care what we call it. Someone decided that should feel like bad luck. Some process, some convergence, some institutional logic whose precise outline I cannot fully reconstruct, but whose effects I can document and accumulate and point toward, decided that the accurate count of the moon should produce in ordinary people a feeling of unease. That decision shaped calendars. It shaped architecture. It shaped the quiet automatic flinch that moves through a room when someone notes the date, and we have, most of us, long since stopped asking why we flinch at all.